I think that this moment has so much opportunity, and I think that this is a moment that requires radical candor. So in my style, I decided to share some things that I just always hear my Black friends, Black colleagues, even over the years, I've heard talked about in Black circles, but I don't necessarily think is shared with white colleagues or white friends. And I think that when we think about really truly advancing, moving things forward, strengthening those relationships, changing corporate cultures, we have to make room to discuss the undiscussables. So uncomfortable truth number one, racism doesn't just show up in its most extreme form. There's indeed a continuum of racist behaviors. And unfortunately, some of your behaviors might actually be on that continuum. So uncomfortable truth number two, even if you haven't personally offended anyone that you know of, you still might be part of the problem. And one of the reasons why I say this is I think back to my favorite Martin Luther King quote, "In the end, we'll remember not the words of our enemies, but the silence of our friends." How many of us have been that silent friend? I know I have. I'm sure many of us have. So that's one of the reasons why I say we need to look introspectively, because you may be one of those people who disagrees with what's being said, disagrees with what's being done, but you're not necessarily doing anything actively to make that clear or to change your environment. So even though you may not have personally done something, you may indeed be part of the problem. The great thing is you can also be part of the solution. So uncomfortable truth number three, every Black person on your team or on your project is not necessarily your friend. Sometimes I think that we're a little bit too loose with that word. We just kind of assume that, hey, we're on this team and we see each other every day. You know, of course, we're great friends. And of course, sometimes that is the case. Certainly, you can have that. But the truth is that oftentimes we live pretty segregated lives. Once we leave work or leaves the office, oftentimes we're driving home, we're listening to our radio station, which reflects our culture and our community, and we pull into a driveway. It might be a fairly segregated subdivision or part of town, and none of that is bad. None of that is bad. It's just absolutely natural. But the truth is that workplaces are often what bring us together, but it can also lull us into a false sense of diversity and inclusion. It's completely natural to gravitate to people that you share a background with, you share the same culture, you share similar experiences. That's kind of the whole concept behind these affinity groups that a lot of corporations have. And that's a wonderful, wonderful thing. So that's not bad. But sometimes when we just make that assumption that, hey, I'm around Black people all the time, or I've got lots of Black friends because there are lots of Black people on my team, it prevents us from doing the real work that we really might need to do to diversify our networks. So uncomfortable truth number four is that gender discrimination and racial discrimination are not just essentially the same thing. They truly are different. And I don't say this to try to compare trauma, compare oppression. All oppression is horrific. Like I tell my kids all the time, it's not a contest. But unfortunately, sometimes we tend to conflate the two. And when we conflate the two, it doesn't acknowledge the uniqueness of racial discrimination or the uniqueness of the challenges that many Black people face in society and in the workplace. Racial discrimination is very unique. It's certainly abhorrent, and we don't want to conflate the two. The reason why I raise this is that I see this so often in organizations. They look at their board or they look at their executive team or their leadership, and they see, oh, we've got a couple women here. We don't have any discrimination issues. We don't have diversity problems. Check. we're good on diversity, and that is so dangerous. We can't just assume that because there are a few women on the board or there are a few women in executive roles that we don't have diversity and inclusion issues and challenges. So gender discrimination, racial discrimination, both horrible, but they're not the same. So uncomfortable truth number 5 is that even though there may be 1 or 2 Black faces on your executive team or in your leadership ranks, you still might have a rampant diversity and inclusion problem. And this happens all the time when 1 or 2 people, Black people, are put in a position of leadership, but they're not really given any real authority, or the culture really hasn't shifted, or there isn't true inclusion in the organization. There really is this element of tokenism, and that could be so dangerous. So there's a difference between having 1 or 2 people in the role and fundamentally having an inclusive culture. D&I experts like to talk about that as being invited to the ball, but having nobody ask you to dance. So there's a difference between having some diversity, having some representation, and truly having inclusion as part of the fabric of that culture, or part of the DNA of that organization. One of the great things about this moment is there's an appetite for discussing the undiscussables, for having some of these uncomfortable conversations. So these are just 5 from me, but I encourage you to have your own uncomfortable conversations. So I encourage you, be vulnerable, be open, be transparent, dip your toe in the water, be willing to show up as your authentic self and to have that uncomfortable conversation.